Good morning, bonjour, good day. Us Australians have a different language. I think everyone should learn different language words. Can I hear good day? No, you drag it out, good day. Okay. I do that not just to teach you a new language, but I need to say you've got the cutest accent of anyone I know. And boy, do I love to hear a room of people with that type of access. Can I just thank Ron for his very generous introductions. I could hardly wait to hear myself speak after all those nice things. And it's just a privilege to be here. I just love being back in Canada. This is my 25th trip to Canada. I've had the opportunity of working in most of the provinces and particularly in the small towns. And boy, do I love to be here. But I approached this morning with a little bit of apprehension. Firstly, you've given me a topic to talk about that I'm incredibly passionate about. Small towns and their future, their vibrant future, their sustainable future. And I can literally speak for hours about that topic. But realise I do have a clock. I realise that many of you need to be out here by 12 o'clock. And looking at a whole pile of people in the Irish pub last night, I realised many of you need to get to that bar for lunch as soon as possible. Can I say I had an experience in South Africa, though, that reinforced how important it is to keep to time. We had a rural conference there in the northern part of KwaZulu-Natal, and the local mayor was invited to just give a 10 to 15 minute introduction, paint the context. Well, an hour and a half later, he's still giving his 10-minute introduction. You can imagine the audience. People were shuffling. Even his own wife was trying to give him the evil eye to shut up. And eventually, he realised what he'd done. And I'll never forget the reaction. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm awfully sorry, but my watch has stopped." And someone in the audience yelled out, "But there was a bloody calendar on the wall." And I always hope that that won't be my experience. Secondly, I don't know if you're aware of how far away Australia and the Southern Hemisphere is, but it took 28 hours of travel time to get here. And the consequence of that is simply you are incredibly jet lagged. I woke at 1 a.m. this morning. I have been alive and well since 1 a.m. My body clock tells me it is midnight. I could easily today fall asleep in the middle of this talk. It reminds me of the story of the 8th Duke of Devonshire, a British politician at the turn of the century, there in 1903, addressing the House of Lords. Woke up to find he is there dreaming that he was addressing the House of Lords, and woke up to find he was. And I hope that that will not be my experience, kind of like here today. Can I say I'm excited to give this address for 3 very good reasons. Firstly, this is Canada, and I need to say I do have a link. My origins, my great-grandfather left March Township around the 1850s to head out to Australia for the gold rushes. Our family date back to this particular province. As I said, I've had the opportunity of working here on 25 occasions. Saskatchewan, British Columbia, certainly here in Ontario, Nova Scotia. I've been to a place called La Ronge. Anyone been to La Ronge? Well, in Saskatchewan, I've been there 3 times to kind of like run workshops. And boy, do I love this particular place. And certainly I love the similarities that we share, particularly in rural Australia. We're a big country, we're a diverse country, our landscapes are just so different from place to place. We are a place also that I think acknowledges that we have a long history, way beyond that European kind of like settlement. I'm proud to say I come from a country that has the longest continuous culture anywhere in the world, 70,000 years. And like you, we are made up of this patchwork of tribes and nations across the country. And to any of your Indigenous members here today, I just want to acknowledge you and thank you for the privilege of walking on your lands, as I would say in Australia. I've had the privilege of particularly spending time in the remote areas of our country where particularly our Indigenous Australians are just in terms of concentration and in terms of settlement. And to me, it was an amazing experience with my friend Jonathan, who said, "Pete, I want to take you and I want to go for a walk on country." What he forgot to say is it was a 15-kilometre walk and it almost killed me. But eventually we reached this hillock. And he said, "Peter, what do you think of this place? This is Kakadu, this is the Northern Territory, this is stunning landscapes." And I mouthed all of those type of words. But he said, "Oh, Pete, there's just one other thing. We had archaeologists here recently, and where you and I are sitting, they've identified that this is the oldest known settlement site anywhere in the world." Is that one of those assets that you talk about? So, like you, we have a very, very long history, over 70,000 years of history. And boy, I am proud of this country and I'm proud of those roots that also bring me back here, particularly to Canada. But there's one area that we don't share in common, and it's called the weather. As I looked at the weather and studied up as I was about to fly to Toronto, that was kind of like the message. A weather alert, all of those type of words. Niagara Falls, kind of like in that particular state and whatever. You know where I'm coming from? Most of our temperatures currently are in the mid-40s. My hometown of Marble Bar yesterday was 49 degrees. That's not Fahrenheit, that is centigrade. Amazing, it's one of the areas that we do not share in common. How did you share Christmas? Well, that's the traditional Australian type of Christmas. I am sure yours is very, very different. But you know what? We do share so much in common. And it's amazing as I crisscross small towns in Australia, just how many young Canadian women I found who have actually married Australian farmers. They all met on Conti tours or kind of like backpacking around Europe. And boy, have they brought so much to kind of like our rural areas. The second reason I'm excited to be here is I'm amongst people who care. And I don't think, like my friend from Tamarack, there here in Ontario, Paul Bourne, who put it so well, the greatest asset of any community are people who care. And I know that you care. You wouldn't have put up your hand to go in local government if you didn't care about your community. And I've just had the privilege the last 2 days to have so many amazing conversations and lots of beers with people who care, and to hear your stories and why you've stood up to become a local councillor, or why you work in local government, and why you're proud of your community. And to me, that is the greatest asset. And your role as a leader is to find other people who care. And together, boy, you can do anything in terms of where you want that community to go. And the third reason I'm excited to be here is you've asked me to talk about small communities. This is my home. This is where I was born. Born to a gold miner, born to the mother who was the nurse in the town. It's called Marble Bar. It's up there in the Pilbara, today a population of 200 people. It's got the record of being Australia's hottest town. In 1933-34, the temperature went over 100 degrees Fahrenheit for 165 consecutive days. That's like 5 months. But boy, you know, this town, like so many others, has a sense of community and a sense of kind of like what wellness is actually all about. And I have spent my life living in these type of communities. And as an organisation over the last 30 years, we've been committed to trying to play a small part in supporting people who just want to retain kind of like this amazing network and fabric of small towns, not just across Australia, but New Zealand and South Africa and Southern Africa, the US, Canada, places like this. One of the handouts I've just left on your seat is the result of that 30 years. There's kind of like 20 kind of like ingredients that we think we've identified that make a difference. So if you're actually bored with what I'm saying, just go through that 20. Tick the ones that you think, wow, you know what, we're doing that. And put a cross against those who think, you know what, maybe we need to do something kind of like else. Living in a small town has heaps of advantages. It also has its drawbacks, and I love this quote. The nice thing about living in a small town is when you don't know what you're doing, someone else does. And I'm sure all of us can kind of like identify with that kind of like type of experience. But this work with small towns has really taught us as an organisation 4 kind of like critical lessons that I want to start with today before I return to talking about your leadership role within kind of like small towns. And the first one is very obvious. The future ain't what it used to be. We've got to stop using some of the old paradigm ways of doing things. The future is radically different. And when I look at the issues of Australian small towns, I'm sure you can identify with just so many of these type of particular issues. You know, in the wheat belt where I now spend most of my time, we have the highest youth suicide rate anywhere on the planet. Why are young people out there in remote and isolated wheat belt areas committing suicide on the levels they are? Huge issue for us. The limited education and health and childcare. These are some of the issues that are so important. The ageing. The Red Cross have identified that in the wheat belt by 2025, which is only 6 years away, the average age of the wheat belt will be 65 years old. The average age of farmers out there currently is 63. These are issues for us. And as for services, the little town of I.D.E.A.S, let me show the bank staff there in 1975. Today that town doesn't even have a bank. In fact, that town hardly has any services at all. The future ain't what it used to be. And of greater concern to me is the decline that we're actually seeing in social capital. We've had this book produced in Australia that looks at what's happened to Australia, both city and rural Australia, since 1950 through to 2010. And what you see on the right is my crude summary of what that book tells us. And fundamentally, we're just not connecting and getting engaged with each other like we used to. Do you know in Australia today only 1 in 3 people can tell you the name of their neighbours on either side? Certainly better in rural Australia, but it's even there we're starting to see change. Even worse, only 33% of people trust their neighbours. Why? Because they don't know their neighbours. These are issues that really are also affecting our life. And certainly we are seeing such decline in people's willingness to get involved. Volunteerism in Australia, including rural Australia, is on rapid decline. Most of our towns struggle to find people to fill those emergency services and those services that people traditionally done. People claim they haven't got time. They still have time in Australia to watch 3 hours of television a night, but claim they haven't got time. And to me, the best analogy I know of what most of our rural communities are like is it can be compared to an ice hockey game, where 20,000 people who need the exercise turn up to watch 12 players who don't. And it seems to me that while we continue to run our small towns that way, and you know what, we contribute to that. The type of community development practices we've created is that we have turned people into spectators. We've turned them, in Australia, local government now calls people customers. Well, if I'm called a customer, I pay my rates, I expect things. There's an entitlement now in Australia that's unbelievable. The health department calls people consumers. Non-for-profit organisations now call people clients. Do you know where the word client comes from? It's a Latin word meaning I'm lying on my back and I need someone to help me stand up. We don't need clients, we don't need customers, we don't need consumers. You know what we need? Citizens. People who care, people who want to get involved. And yet today, we are very much like the ice hockey game. And then there's a whole pile of other issues that really our small towns are kind of like impacted upon. So many national debates are hitting our town. Stuff about foreign ownership, immigration, the red tape stuff. The whole thing about governments wanting to amalgamate local government hangs over many of our communities continuously. The fly-in, fly-out policies that governments have created. In my state alone, there are 50,000 miners in the air every week flying into the Pilbara from all over Australia. Imagine if those 50,000 miners with families were located in our rural and remote areas, the differences that would make. These are issues that certainly kind of like affect us. Fracking, a massive issue now in Australia. And the demand constantly to rationalise services to small towns. This guy has continued over the years to push that any town under 4,000 is not viable. Our provincial state government tried to close down 140 Aboriginal settlements last year, all on economic grounds. This is home. This is where people for kind of like generations have lived. This is where people kind of like are committed. And governments are now saying, hang on, we just cannot afford it. So people in our small towns are really under pressure. And the reality is that 60% of our inland small towns are dying. 60%. They're losing population, losing business life, and young people certainly don't want to be found dead in these places. But you know what the good news is? 40% aren't. 40% are growing. And I suppose what I want to share with you is what's the difference between that 60% and that 40%. And a lot of it comes back to the critical issue this morning called leadership. Most of those 60% towns are run by people who've had a charisma bypass at some stage in their life. They have lost any sense of what a viable, sustainable future could be, and certainly there isn't the energy. And what are they doing? They're sitting there waiting for the cavalry to turn up from the Sydneys and Melbournes and the Perths of this world. They're waiting for someone else. They can't do anything unless someone else pays for it. They can't do it unless they've got a Main Street grant or something else. And yet the 40% that are growing, boy, have they given us some interesting insights into what can be done to sustain a town. And that's what I'd love to share with you today. And linked to that is the second lesson that we've learnt, and that is that whatever the issue, community, not the government, not the latest funding program, but community is the answer. Many of you know Ernesto Ciroli, an Australian who's worked across Canada. I love what he said. The future of every community lies in capturing the passion, the imagination and resources of its people. Boy, do I believe that. And do I believe passionately that strong communities are created when citizens become producers of their own future. You know what we've done? We've replaced them by professionals. We now do things to and for community. What we've got to do, and particularly local government, is got to begin to create a lot more space of and by the people. We are good at doing things to and for. We're very poor at doing things of and by. And it just seems to me we need to kind of like start beginning to kind of like look at how communities begin to take control of their own future. And the third issue related to that is that in Australia we're beginning to discover that the role of local government is not to service community per se, but to strengthen community. The aim of local government should be to build strong and vibrant communities. I love asking people in local government, what do you think is the purpose of local government? And the vast bulk of them, where the staff or councillors talk about, well, we're there to kind of like fix the roads and drainage and all those other issues that people had questions about today. Didn't hear a lot of questions about how do we engage our communities? How do we develop the people factor there? You know, servicing a community is part of strengthening a community, but it doesn't equal I certainly do not want to have to take my rubbish to the tip. I love the coordinated rubbish delivery. I love many services that local government do. But the thing that we're learning is that the prime role of local government should be to really strengthen community. And one of the sheets that you have on your seats is that we had this major conference last year in Melbourne run by the Municipal Association Victoria. And it was called The Future of Local Government. And have a look at that little 2-page manifesto. It's got some amazing words. These are people like yourself coming from across Australia wanting to look at the future. And there is just some of the key phrases that kind of like come out. I love that one, learning to be community-led, making space for communities to take action themselves. If you're not doing that, you are not strengthening community. Community comes when people together are committed to making things happen. I love to challenge people in local government to say, which quadrants do you function in? How much of what you do is to community? How much is for community? How much do you do with community? And how much space and opportunity do you create for of and by the community? And you know what? It's that bottom right-hand quadrant where strength comes. Building a vibrant community needs to make sure that is not ignored. I'm one of those people who said, you know, the language we use matters. I can't believe that local government in Australia wants to now call people customers. You know, customers have expectations. Customers expect. What I'm interested is people becoming co-designers, co-producers. What I need in local government are leaders who can actually see that they're not there to kind of like tell communities what to do or do things for them, or see that their whole thing is to help people. What I want to see is together creating sustainable, inclusive, connected communities, ones that do have a future. One of the things that most of our local governments now have committed to is what's called IAP2, the International Association of Public Participation. It's a model that now most of our staff in Australia are now being trained, and many councillors have been trained. And what it fundamentally says is, you know, there's 5 kind of like levels of engaging your community. And the most basic one, and the one we tend to always come back to, is to inform. Well, there is a role for informing. You know, there is a role for that. As I flew into Toronto on Sunday night and there was a snowstorm coming down, the last thing I wanted was to have an encounter group on the plane amongst the passengers to kind of like tell the pilot how to land the plane. I was very happy to leave it to his technical kind of like expertise. And there is a role where we do inform. There is a role where we just want to consult. We're thinking of doing A, B or C. Which one do you like? But you know where strong communities come? The more we move up, and to that one called empower. This is probably the most useful kind of like slide I will share with you today. If you haven't seen that framework, have a look at it. It's so practical. Go onto our website, there's a whole handbook there of 60 tools you can do to kind of like genuinely engage your community in terms of where it's at and where it needs to go. And finally, can I say the lesson that we've learnt is that the most important factor in the long-term success of communities is this thing called leadership. You know, over 20 years ago, our federal government decided to pay a group called McKinsey & Co, an international consultancy firm, $1 million to work out why certain regions in Australia were going ahead and other regions were going back. And after $1 million worth of work, they came out with a report that was summarised by that one sentence. I reckon that sentence was worth $1 million. Given the task of rejuvenating a region and the choice of $50 million, or just $2 million, but 20 committed local leaders, we would choose the smaller amount of money and the committed leaders. You look at every report that has been done on regional and rural development in Australia, and this thing called leadership and its renewal and development is constantly emphasised. The Heartland Centre for Leadership Development in the States gave us a brilliant statement about why this thing called leadership and the type of thing that comes with it is just kind of like so important. General Patton, though, once said, leadership is the thing that wins battles. I have it, but I'm damned if I can define it. And that's why we've tended always to find leadership as attributes. Well, I find that is a load of crap. What I'm much more interested in is saying that there are certain functions of leadership rather than traits of leadership. And to me, there are 6 important functions, and I think these are functions that people in local government need to use as an indicator. And let me just quickly share those with you. And at the top of the list, I want to put this thing that leadership is actually about making things happen. I love what John Gardner, an advisor to 6 US presidents, said. A leader's task is to open doors and windows, to make things happen. Tom Peters, sooner or later, all the thinking and planning has to degenerate into work. Leaders make things happen. They don't just commission reports. They don't just collect data. They actually get things done. I love that particular cartoon. I just think that is what I'm interested in. And boy, do we need people in our small towns who are willing to roll up their sleeves and make things happen. Let me share with you the second nicest community I know amongst small towns across the globe after your community. And it's a place called Coolin. Coolin's 3 hours into the wheat belt. 20 years ago, I never forget being asked to come and facilitate a conversation out there about their future. They were desperate. They were down to 289 people. And I can remember coming that night, and I'll still remember there were 63 people in the room in their cold little town hall. And as we started that meeting, I shared with them the small town tale. And what I said, there was once this small town, it was in all sorts of trouble. There was only one shop open in the main street. And the mayor of that town said, you know what, we need help. And there's this guy out there that knows a lot about small towns. He's an expert, he's a guru in this area. We need to get him in to kind of like tell us what to do. And so this small community of 400 people invited this guru in. Over 200 of them gathered in the town hall to listen to what he would tell them. And as he got up to the stage, he began the night with a question. And the question is, do you know what I'm going to tell you? And there was this murmur across the room, and people basically said no. And then he shocked them and said, well, if you don't know what I'm going to tell you, there's no purpose in me being here. Sorry you've gone to all this trouble and expense, but I'm leaving. And he just walks down through the middle of the hall, outside, jumps in his car and drives off into the sunset. And he leaves behind 200 stunned people in the room. They couldn't believe it. How rude. They'd gone to all this trouble. It cost them all this money. The sad thing is, though, that over the coming weeks, things in that small town deteriorated even further. The one store in the town announced it was closing. Boy, they were desperate. And so the mayor gathered together his councillors and said, listen, we've got to do something. And I reckon that guru does have answers. I reckon we didn't pay him enough. I don't think we were polite enough. We've got to get him back. Anyway, they stupidly invited him back. And so, again, a group of townspeople gathered. This time it's down to 140 people. And to their horror, he begins with the same question. Do you know what I'm going to tell you? Now, they remembered what happened last time. So this time they all yell out, yes, yes. To which he said, well, now you know what to do. There's no purpose in me being here. Just get on. And walks down the middle of the hall, out the front, and drives off. Well, you can imagine how shattered they are. The weeks go by, the months go by, and that town continues to deteriorate. The old mayor is now desperate. He brings together his council and said, listen, I reckon he's just testing us. I reckon he's just kind of like trying to push us. I believe he has the answers. And so for a third time, they invite him back. Now, this time, only 60 people turn up at the town meeting. And to their horror, he begins with the same question. Do you know what I'm going to tell you? Now, this time they're organised. Half the audience yell out, yes, half yell out, no. To which he responds and says, well, those of you who know now need to get together with those who don't know, and we'll all know. Just do it. It is your community. And he walks out with a parting comment, please do not invite me back. What is the purpose of that story? What is behind it? Well, one of my great Ontario friends here, many of you will know him, Harold Fleming, once shared with me these words, the wisdom of a community always exceeds the knowledge of the experts. And boy, have we forgotten that. And so that night I wanted to remind them, this is not about me turning up to tell you what to do. This is about you using the oldest tool in the toolbox to begin to engage in this thing called conversation. Start identifying what it is that each of you care about. That's the most important asset in any town, finding out what people care about and who else cares about that. And what are the assets and opportunities and possibilities that we can work on. And boy, that night did they get excited. They started to identify their assets. They created a vehicle called Cultivating Coolant. And the very first thing they decided to do was to have a mission statement. And what they wanted to do was to stop the depopulation and the loss of service. And they identified two things. Let's become more than a dot on the map. Let's build local pride and commitment. Let's get families, when they retire, to stay in town. Let's get kids staying at the local school rather than going to boarding school in Perth. And what did they do? Well, the first thing they identified is that they used to have a famous race event there that they hadn't run for 60 years. A local farmer said, I got the spectacular bit of land alongside a lake. It's only 12 k's out of town. I'm willing to give you a 99 lease for $2. And the town created a special event. And on the Queen's birthday, which is in September, a long weekend, between 7,000 and 10,000 people descend on this town for this amazing weekend of entertainment. It's won state, provincial and national awards as a tourist event. Businesses generate more in those 3 days than probably 12 months of trade. It's put the town on the map. And boy, it was the first thing that they decided to do, was to create the cool and kind of like race bush events. It's one of the craziest, most wonderful weekends of your life where people come and camp out around that particular lake. And then they did a stupid thing. They said to their young people, what is it you think would make a difference in this town? Well, this is a town that this week hit 48 degrees. It's bloody hot out there. And young people said, you know what? We need a water slide. Well, you ask young people what they want, maybe you need to respond to that. And a farmer then went onto the internet and realised there was a second-hand water slide for sale on the Gold Coast. They only wanted $700,000 for it. And that farmer, who was a councillor on the local council, decided to raise that money across the community, and he and 3 mates drove their 4 trucks 6,000 kilometres across the Nullarbor and back again. They dismantled it, brought it back, and they have created the biggest water slide anywhere in regional Australia. This is a town of 289 people. And guess this week where every family in the wheat belt are spending their weekends and evenings. Coolant has become a destination within the region. Amazing. And then they said, you know what? You don't get a second chance at first impressions. We've got the ugliest main street in the wheat belt. It doesn't need to be like that. It needs to be green, it needs to be flowers all year. It's hot out here, but when people drive into this town, boy, have they got to feel that this is an amazing place to be. And they then started to harvest all of the water that comes in a couple of months, build huge tanks, and then in the summer months, pump it back. So all year, you drive in this town and boy, does it have a wow factor in terms of what it's about. And then they just lost their bank. And they said, well, The bank didn't close down because it was losing money. The big boys who run banks in Australia closed it because they wanted to make more money by kind of like selling off all their little country branches, culling staff. And they said, you know what? The bank's the most profitable business in town. We're going to own our own bank. And again, they raised $700,000 and went into partnership with a regional bank. Today, that bank employs 6 staff. 4 of them are young people. It opens on a Saturday morning. And the best thing, all the profit goes back to the community. Last year, this town returned back $300,000 to the community as a financial kind of like benefit. And then when they started running these race events, farmers are kind of like crazy people, and they started building all these tin horses along the road. And suddenly people started to kind of like see it. And someone said, you know what, we've got a famous tourist attraction down the road, but most people take the interstate to get there. Why don't we create an alternative route to what's called Wave Rock? Why don't we call it the Tin Horse Highway? We've already got these farmers kind of like doing these tin horses. We've got about 40 of them. Imagine if we run a few workshops, we could have 200 of them. And so what do? They have just built this amazing kind of like piece of art. They realised asking Main Roads would kind of like give a standard no if they wanted to kind of like create the Tin Horse Highway. They said, you know what, much better to beg forgiveness than ask permission. They just did it. Put up their own signs, call it the Tin Horse Highway, and invited the Premier, whose name was Gallop, to come and open it. He could not resist kind of like the media exposure of Premier Gallop opening the Tin Horse Highway. You know, that has now become one of the major tourist routes in Australia. Absolutely amazing what's actually happened. And then other things, they checked their history. We went to war with the States to Vietnam. We conscripted our young people. The very first conscript ever killed in Vietnam was a Corporal Hart, whose parents ran the post office in Kulin. Now, in honour of that, they decided to become a Vietnam vet-friendly town. They built a campsite along the race route. Almost every weekend there are scores of Vietnam vets coming into the town. During the race weekend, there can be up to 200 Vietnam vet families come and spend the weekend there. They build appropriate housing. They're crazy with their tourism. You walk into their toilet block, you go into the men's, you close the door, you drop your DAX, and on the back of the door is a poster saying, don't just sit there, have a look at the 6 things you can't miss in our town before you leave. They go everything. They go to people in the caravan park and say, we want to give you honorary citizenship to Kulin. All you've got to do is put a 6x4 poster on the side of your caravan as you move around Australia. Do you know there's now over 500 vans travelling around Australia promoting the little town of Kulin? This is an amazing community, one that's used its history and one that then said, we need an industry. And they heard about a woman who was running camps for kids suffering from trauma, refugee kids, foster kids. And they rang her and said, you ever thought of running your business in Kulin? We, the local government, would like to create a municipal enterprise. Come out. She drove into Kulin and like everyone, she said, wow. She couldn't believe the energy of the town. She moved the business, became a council staff member. We now employ 5 kind of like youth workers out there, and over 1,000 kids a year come and spend a week at Camp Kulin out there. There's over 100 volunteers who give their time to come out there. You know what that's done for the local economy? What it's done for the image of the town? And that young woman this year was the Rural Woman of Australia for what she had done in a small town. Amazing story. Has it made a difference? Well, the first thing is, you know, in 20 years, the population's doubled. There are now 550 people live in Kulin. Mightn't sound a lot, but that's doubled. And the interesting thing is every town around them has halved their population. They have doubled. And secondly, the evidence tells us that there are more babies now born in Kulin than any other place in Australia because of all of these amazing 30-year-old women who've kind of like moved in and whatever. Boy, has it made a difference. How did that happen? A small council, a group of farmers come councillors, And women out there came together and said, you know what? We need to make things happen out here. That's what I mean about making things happen. The second thing is that I believe leadership is about creating vision. To me, this thing called shared vision is so important. And it's people like you that need to help to paint that vision for people. I love that quote. True leadership involves a vision and inspiring people around you to work with it. You know, there was this little town out, the little community called Brim on the western part of Victoria. The town had died. They've only got one business left open. No one goes to Brim. A young girl who'd been brought up on a farm there comes back after doing an arts course. She looked at these silos that had been there for 120 years. Everyone else in the town thought they only stored grain. What she saw was a canvas. And what she said, you know what? We could create a most amazing trail called the Silo Trail. She recognised just painting one silo wasn't good, but if you got 6 towns together, you could create a trail. And fundamentally, she inspired a whole set of small towns, not one of them over 200 in population. Every one of them painted something different, whether it be some of their old farmers, whether it be their young people that they actually captured, whether it be their Indigenous leaders who lived in that particular town. They're all floodlit at night. It's one of the most spectacular kind of like arts trails you can do anywhere in Australia. And it's estimated between 30 and 50,000 people every weekend out of Melbourne and Adelaide are kind of like driving the trail to have a look at it. You know when something works when Australia Post create a postage stamp of it. It's been amazingly successful. That's vision. One young 28-year-old woman providing that leadership to make things happen. If I've got a quote I love about leadership, it's this one. If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, become more, you are a leader. As I said, I can't believe how many people have had a charisma bypass, are wanting to be a leader. You've got to inspire people. You've got to actually kind of like encourage people in that community to say, you know what, this place matters. We've got to leave a legacy, not just for our kids and our grandkids, but our great-grandkids in terms of where we can go. And one of the ways to do that is to become an ideal, friendly town. Encourage people to bring forth ideas, encourage people to kind of like share their wildest dreams. And you never know where those ideas go. If I've got a favourite quote, it's this: whoever invented the first wheel was smart, whoever invented the other 3 was a genius. And it just seems to me that when you bring people together over coffee and start sharing ideas, things go somewhere. I love this quote of Margaret Wheatley. One of the things we need to learn is that every great change starts with small conversations held amongst people who care. And if there's one role I encourage you to be, is to host conversations in your community. Bring people together face to face. Use kind of like rituals that you might do it. I love this North American community. It's got this wonderful heritage bridge. And once a year, what do? They create a long table and bring people, and people just write their ideas and share around the table where they could see their community going in the next 12 months. You know, we've just got to encourage people. There is no power for change than greater than a community discovering what it cares about. And we've got to create the scenarios and the situations where that stuff actually happens. The fourth role you've got to take on is to facilitate collaboration. This guy's from the little town of Stanley. He invented permaculture. I love what Bill said. I can't save the world on my own. It'll take at least 3 of us. And what he was trying to say is we've got to hold hands with each other. And you know what I've discovered? Community building is all about relationship, kind of like building. Now, if I've got a third best town in Australia after yours and that little town of Coolin, it'd have to be this place called Beechworth. I knew this town in Victoria 30 years ago. It was padded up with galvanised iron, 29 staff in a town of 4,000 people. Not bad for a little cafe bakery. And today, it is the biggest turnover bakery in the Southern Hemisphere. A little tiny town on a road to nowhere, 3 hours out of a capital city. Amazing. That's what it looks like at 9 o'clock in the morning. When I took that photo, there were 302 people in the bakery. I visited 3 other bakeries in the region. One had 2 customers, one had 1 customer, and they had 302. What's the difference? Well, 299 if you're counting. This is what he's pulled off. He employs 76 staff in a town of 4,000 people. This is not a wholesale bakery, this is a retail bakery. He'll turn over $8 million. This year, 800,000 people go through his door. There's only 4,000 in the town. And the jail is still there, and 280 of them are still in the prison. Amazing. And it hasn't been a one-town success story. He's replicated it now in kind of like 7 other small towns around Victoria. He's now one of the biggest private employers of people in rural Victoria. You know what's interesting, though, about this guy? He can't read and write. He can't use a calculator. And the question you've got to ask is, how do you make dough his way? Well, the interesting thing is he said it's nothing to do with products and services. It's all about relationships. And he said in a small town there are 4 critical relationships that anyone, whether they're a civic leader or a commercial leader, need to consider. The first is the customer. There's no bigger economic issue in rural Australia than customer service. It's appalling. I was in a little town the other day and I lost my watch. I went in and I said to the 2 staff who didn't acknowledge me for 11 minutes because their weekend conversation was more important. And eventually when they said, yeah, what can we do? And I said, I've lost my watch. You've got 2 in the cabinet. One's $50, the other's $150. Can you tell me the difference between the 2 watches? They looked at it and said $100. Wasn't even a joke. That was all they could contribute. You know, this is a guy that does look after the customer. He never takes less than $20,000 on a Sunday, but he does spend $1,500 on a jazz band on the balcony. He's a baker. He realises the strongest sense is smell. You know what he's done? He's created pipes from his bakehouse to his veranda, fans on the veranda, and he's pumping hot bread smells up and down the main street. No wonder he gets 800,000 people. You know, he has a guy 3 days a week who visits every B&B hotel motel within a 200-kilometre radius of Beechworth. He takes him a bag of fresh biscuits and says, why don't you treat your customer to a free cappuccino at the Beechworth Bakery? You can see in the top right-hand corner, they're all numbered. Guess what? 1 in 3 of these end up back in the Beechworth Bakery. He tells me that Canadians in particular will drive 2 hours out of their way for a free coffee and so on. August is the worst trading month. He's turned it into Kiddies Month. He invites every pre-primary school, every kindergarten to come into the bakery. He said, you know, imagine the chaos that these brats create. But he said every one of them, as they take their biscuits home, become an ambassador, become a disciple for the Beechworth Bakery. And 1 in 4 will return within the month with their parents. Boy, he understands. He understands that you turn your shop into festival stuff. Every month there's something happening. You turn the main street into action. This is why this guy has turned a town around. And boy, in his shop he has all these tells your ideas that I can do it better. He doesn't employ consultants. He listens to the customer. I spoke to Tom only 3 days ago. We're very close friends. And he said, Peter, I had this little 7-year-old came in and she wrote on one of my forms, Mr. Beechworth Baker, there were too many people in your shop and your prices were too expensive. So back went a message from the staff. Sorry, Joanne, for your bad experience. Please find enclosed $20 to make up for your bad experience. Signed the Beechworth Baker. He said the little brat rang me 2 days later and said, I was there with 2 mates. Do they get $20 also? You know? He said, that is the relationship. He said, the second is the staff. Have a look at that quote. People in the town criticised for the effort. He sent 4 staff to America this year to do work experience. Amazing. Absolutely amazing what he actually does. There is a commitment. This is the millennial. This is the Generation Y group. Guess what? They like to travel, but they want to keep job security. He set up an exchange program with a bakery in Norway, one in New Zealand, and another one in Ireland, where staff can swap jobs for 12 months. They swap jobs, swap houses, swap cars, keep the same partner, and have a fantastic year. And so on. The local community, he's at the forefront of fundraising. The bushfires that went through, where was the operational centre? It was the bakery. He engages with community. And finally, you go into that Beechworth bakery and the placemats on the table. They don't talk about the Beechworth bakery. You know what they tell you? The 6 other businesses you've got to visit in town before you leave. He understands relationships. He chairs the local Chamber of Commerce. And boy, what he's saying is that it's all about relationships. And finally, can I say, instilling positive mindset is so important. You know, this guy, Roy Powell, has written more about small towns in Australia than any other person. He's been studying them for 60 years. He's now in his late 80s as a professor. And I love what he said about what is the secret between small towns. And boy, it is all about mindset, and that comes from leadership. I love that quote. You can't move your town to a different location. You can move your town's attitude in a different direction. Last night I had the privilege to drink many beers with that group from Chatham, Kent, and Mayor Darren. Where's Mayor Darren? You know, they run a 12-day positivity program. I love stuff like that. It's amazing. And if you want to see it in action, go to this town called Christchurch, hit by the earthquake. The leader behind it is Mayor Vicky Buck. She's amazing. You know, she gives out giraffe awards for people who are prepared to stick out their neck and have a go. She really sees, when I asked her what's the one role in leadership, she said it's to make negative people deviants, because that's what they are. Have a look what she says. I think negative people should be taxed. They require an incredible amount of energy. They're like corgis nibbling at your ankles. And I'm sure they exist to show the difference between heaven and hell. This is one of her favourite quotes. When you're facing a difficult task, act as if it's impossible to fail. When going after Moby Dick, bring along the tartare sauce. I had fortunately used this at a local government conference in Australia a few months ago, and Greenpeace were in the audience. They were not happy. You know, be asset, not deficiency focused. What you focus on actually influences where it's at. You know, this is a negative town. It's a dying town. Why would you put up a sign saying, we have 2 cemeteries and no hospital? Might be a smart driver education sign, but you know what? Not smart for your town to be driving in and out and seeing that. I love this Charlie Brown. Someday we will all die, Snoopy. True, but on all the other days we will not. You know, is the glass half full or is it half empty? How many of you in the room think it's half empty? How many of you think it's half full? How many of you don't think? Yeah. Well, guess what? It's both. But you know what I learnt? You can't do much with the top half. It's the bottom half you can do something with. We're great in local government with doing needs maps. I've worked with 2,000 communities. Every one of them's done a needs map. But I can count on one hand how many have done an asset map. You know what? You never know what a community needs until you first know what they've got. It's like going shopping. You don't go into the supermarket without having a mental knowledge of what you've got in the cupboard. Why aren't we getting into asset maps? Why aren't we developing the wow factor? Boy, some of our country towns are ugly. People accelerate to get through them. It doesn't need to be like that. Why aren't we having more fun? I love Jim Deers. Why hold a meeting when you can have a party? You get a lot more people along. And what have we found? The number one reason why people are not volunteering today in Australia? It's stopped being fun. We've got to get that back and use a bit of novelty and humour. John Cleese, I love what he said, if I can get you to laugh with me, you'll like me better, which makes you much more open to my ideas. I have a beach batch in a small little town. We have a little shop there and people queue up to see what he puts on his notice board every day. This is what he had at Christmas time. All right, you bastards, it's Christmas, start spending. You've got to laugh at it. I love this one, today's offer, buy any 2 drinks and pay for both, you know. I love this one, no senior citizen discounts. You've had twice as long to get the money. You know. And you go into his shop and everything is labelled, you know. That's why he's a commercial success, and why aren't we using more of that? And finally, can I say, leadership is about fostering leadership. A leader creates leaders. Leaders don't create followers, they create more leaders. And what are you doing to kind of like build leadership? I love what this town of Scotts Bluff in Nebraska, they have this wonderful leadership program there, and this is their statement. You want a year of prosperity, grow grass. You want 10 years of prosperity, grow trees. You want 100 years of prosperity, grow people. And boy, it's one of the areas. This is the 4th nicest town in the world after your town, Coolin, Beechworth, comes Tumbarumba. This is a town where people had given up volunteering, and they came up with an amazing idea. You know, every 2 years they fundraise to send every year 11 and 12 student, which are the 16, 17-year-olds, to walk the Kokoda Trail. Now, this is in our folklore. This is where Australian soldiers stopped the Japanese as they were planning to invade Australia. This is tough country. It's a 12-day walk, but boy, you discover yourself. You discover being a citizen, a world citizen. You discover teamwork. And boy, I go to that town and there's no shortage of volunteers. The difference being most of them are young people. They come back and they want to get involved. That's their main investment in leadership. And the tip, actively engage this group. Every one of this group have talent and they have ideas. Meet my friend Chloe, little town of Port Macquarie, 5th best town. She has a unique gift. Where is she every afternoon? She's down the beach doing these amazing beach designs on the beach. This has become a tourist attraction. She's 16 years old. That's what she cares about. And every kid cares about something. One of the great programs that runs called Are You Mad? Are you making a difference? This is about challenging 6, 7, 8-year-olds to be a citizen. Come up with an idea to make a difference to your world. Boy, they come up with some amazing projects. Have a look at this website called Community Minded Kids. Amazing set of resources to get young people at early ages thinking of being a citizen. The town of Potter, they've tracked down all their diaspora, every kid that's left school for the last 40 years. They write them a message every 3 months, reminding them of hometown Potter and inviting them to participate. They get a 10% response rate. The diaspora are so important. And so in closing, can I say these are the roles that we need to reflect upon. This is what actually makes a difference in terms of where you're actually at. And so in closing, can I leave you just 2 quotes? One of them is from Susan Rands. She was a resident of Toronto, someone who had multiple kind of like physical challenges in her life. She did amazing stuff in the disability. Some of you will know about her. I have this quote on my desk to remind me every day of what my purpose is. Our purpose is not to help people. Our purpose is to build a different kind of community for all of us. And finally, can I leave you the oldest definition we have of community building? It comes from 14th century China. It is ancient wisdom. And simply what it says is go to the people, live among them, learn from them, love them, start with what they know, build on what they have, but are the best leaders when the task is done, the people will remark, we have done it ourselves. That is what leadership, and that is the leadership that we need today in our small towns. Thank you. Merci.